The morning sun rose over London, casting a golden glow on the streets that led to Buckingham Palace. The air was crisp and the sound of footsteps, camera shutters, and chatter from excited tourists filled the grand space. Every day the palace gates drew in thousands of visitors from across the world, eager to see the famous royal guards. For many it was a dream to stand before the black iron gates, take photos of the palace, and marvel at the soldiers in their striking uniforms, red tunics, tall bearskin hats, and polished boots. They stood like statues, never moving, never breaking their composure no matter how many people tried to test them. To most tourists, the guards were symbols of history and discipline. To some, however, they were challenges waiting to be mocked. Among the crowd that day, families gathered with young children who clung to their parents' hands. Elderly couples stood with gentle smiles, pointing at the guards with admiration. College students laughed while snapping selfies, and street vendors sold miniature souvenirs of the palace. Everyone seemed to carry excitement in their eyes, but tucked within the sea of visitors was a group that stood out. They were loud, careless, and ready to turn the serious atmosphere into their own playground. This group of foolish tourists did not come simply to observe. They came to test the limits. At first, their actions seemed harmless. They talked loudly, joked among themselves, and pretended to march like soldiers. People nearby frowned at their behavior, but most shrugged it off. After all, it wasn't uncommon to see visitors trying silly things near the guards. But as minutes passed, their behavior became harder to ignore. One of the men walked directly in front of a guard and waved his hand just inches from the soldier's face, laughing loudly when there was no reaction. Another woman pulled out her phone and began recording while mocking the guard's stiff posture. "Look at him. He doesn't even blink," she said, her voice high and mocking. The guard did not flinch. His eyes stared straight ahead, his shoulders square, and his rifle held firm by his side. Every muscle seemed carved from stone, but deep inside the soldier felt the familiar test of patience. Years of training had taught him to ignore distractions, to remain motionless like a living wall of tradition. Around him whispers rippled through the crowd. Some visitors shook their heads, clearly embarrassed for the tourists. Others looked uneasy, as if they feared the group might cross a line. The children nearby pulled closer to their parents, confused by the strange behavior. A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why are they making fun of him?" The father bent down and whispered, "Because they don't understand. That guard is a soldier. He's here to protect, not to play." The boy nodded quietly, his eyes wide with respect. But the foolish tourists didn't hear. Or perhaps they didn't care. Their laughter grew louder as they took turns posing next to the guard. One man pretended to faint dramatically at the soldier's feet, while another clapped his hands near the guard's ears to see if he would react. The crowd gasped softly, expecting a response, but once again the guard did not move. For the disciplined soldier, this was nothing new. Every day he endured hours of discomfort. The weather could be cruel. Icy rain soaking his coat in winter, scorching sun beating on his hat in summer. But still, he stood tall. The boots dug into the stone ground, the weight of the rifle pressed on his shoulder, and yet he never faltered. What made the duty more difficult than the weather or the weight was the constant testing from people who did not understand the meaning of his silence. He was not a statue. He was not a street performer. He was a protector of history, a guardian of tradition, a soldier of the crown. The guards beside him remained just as still, forming an unbroken line of red and black. Their unity was unshakable, their presence powerful, though their stillness made them appear vulnerable to those who did not know better. The foolish tourists saw silence as weakness, as if the guards were powerless to defend themselves. They did not realize that within those quiet figures stood men who had gone through years of training, men who had sworn to serve and protect, men who were ready to act at any moment if a true threat arose. As the crowd thickened, the mischievous group began to draw more attention. Families shifted away, not wanting to be caught in the embarrassment. Some tourists muttered, "They should stop," while others raised their phones, sensing that something dramatic might happen. The air grew heavier, the laughter of the foolish group clashing with the solemn dignity of the guards. The leader of the group, a tall man with sunglasses, grew bolder. He leaned close to a guard and spoke as if daring him to respond. "Do you ever get tired of standing like a statue? Can you even hear me? What's the point of all this?" His friends laughed behind him, cheering him on. To them, this was entertainment, a game to see who could break the unbreakable soldier. But in the crowd, respect was growing stronger than mockery. A woman visiting from abroad placed her hand on her chest and whispered to her friend, "They don't understand what they're dealing with. These guards are not here for their amusement. They represent something greater than all of us." Her friend nodded, watching with concern. The atmosphere felt like the calm before a storm. Every passing second seemed to tighten the tension in the air. The guards remained silent, their discipline shining brighter with every insult hurled at them. The foolish group mistook it for cowardice, but others saw it as strength, an unshaken wall in the face of disrespect. Time moved slowly as more tourists joined the crowd, sensing that something unusual was happening. Dozens of eyes were now fixed on the small group of pranksters. The respectful visitors prayed silently that the tourists would stop before matters escalated. The guards' silence was their shield, but even shields have limits. The foolish tourists, however, could not see the warning signs. They laughed louder, their voices echoing across the palace gates. They danced, they shouted, they mocked. To them, the guards were only men in costumes, actors pretending to be soldiers. But to everyone else, the truth was clear. The guards were more than that. They were living symbols of duty, men who carried the weight of centuries-old traditions on their shoulders. And as the sun climbed higher, shining brightly on the red uniforms and black hats, the question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. How much longer could the guards endure? The tension was rising, the crowd was watching, and the foolish tourists had no idea they were about to discover a truth they would never forget. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace grew heavier as the group of foolish tourists continued their antics. The guards stood like statues, firm and disciplined, while laughter from the unruly group echoed across the wide space. Most visitors came with respect, snapping photos from behind the barriers and speaking in hushed voices. But the loud group seemed to believe the guards were there for their entertainment. Their boldness grew with each passing minute, and the crowd began to sense that something might soon change. A tall man in the group waved his arms dramatically in front of a guard, leaning close as if trying to block his view. His friends cheered him on, recording every moment with their phones. A young woman beside him pretended to mimic the guard's march, stomping her feet in an exaggerated way. The group laughed so loudly that nearby families stepped back, shaking their heads. Children tugged at their parents' hands, asking why the people were being so rude. Parents tried to explain quietly that the guards were not actors, but the lesson was drowned out by the sound of mocking voices. The guards remained still, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The weight of their uniforms, the heat of the sun, and the piercing laughter pressed down on them, yet they did not move. Every second tested their patience, but discipline ran deep in their blood. They had trained to stand through rain, snow, and endless hours of stillness. They had faced worse challenges in silence. But what made the moment more difficult was not the physical strain. It was the careless disrespect of people who did not understand what they represented. The leader of the foolish group, with sunglasses perched on his nose, grew louder. "Come on, mate. Say something. Blink at least," he shouted, standing dangerously close to the guard's shoulder. His voice carried across the space, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Some in the crowd gasped, some frowned, and others held their phones high, ready to capture what they suspected might happen next. Another man in the group took it further. He crouched low, pretending to tie the guard's shoe, though the soldier's boots were polished and laced tightly. When there was no response, he grinned at his friends. "See, nothing. He can't do anything." Their laughter cut through the respectful silence that usually surrounded the palace. The group's actions unsettled the entire crowd. Elderly tourists shook their heads in disappointment. A tour guide whispered urgently to her group, telling them that the guards were not to be mocked, that they were serving soldiers with strict authority. A young boy no older than 10 whispered to his mother, "Why don't they just stop?" His mother hugged him close and replied softly, "Because they don't understand respect." The guards continued to endure. They did not twitch, did not frown, did not break their stare. Yet behind their composure they were alert. Every sound, every movement was noted. Their silence was not weakness but strength, and their stillness was not helplessness but control. They knew their limits, and they knew the exact moment when those limits would be crossed. The crowd sensed it too. The tourists were dancing dangerously close to a line that was never meant to be crossed. Minutes passed, and the mocking grew worse. One woman raised her phone high and shouted instructions to her friends. "Stand closer, closer! Make him laugh, this will go viral." Another man stepped in front of the guard and began to pull faces, sticking out his tongue and flapping his arms like a child. Some tourists chuckled nervously, but most shook their heads, wishing the group would stop. The air was filled with tension, and though the guards remained silent, their silence spoke louder than words. The foolish tourists mistook this silence for fear. They believed the guards were powerless, trapped in their stillness. What they did not know was that the guards' silence was their shield, and when broken it would reveal strength far greater than the group could imagine. But the tourists, blinded by their arrogance, could not see it. To them it was still a game. As the group pressed forward, one of them pretended to stumble across the barrier line, landing just a little too close to the guard. Gasps spread through the crowd. The man quickly stepped back, laughing, but the tension grew sharper. People murmured warnings under their breath. Parents pulled their children closer. Phones rose higher into the air, recording every moment in case the silence finally shattered. A hush began to fall over the respectful visitors. They knew something was building, something that would not end with laughter. The mocking voices of the tourists rang louder in the quiet, filling the space like unwanted noise. Yet the guards held firm, shoulders squared, rifles secure, eyes unblinking. The crowd began to feel a strange kind of respect rise in them, not just for the guards' strength but for their patience. Still, patience has limits. The foolish tourists ignored every warning, every frown from the crowd, every whispered plea to stop. They were too caught up in their own amusement. They wanted to push further, to test the boundary, to capture the moment they could brag about online. But in doing so, they were unknowingly bringing themselves closer to a truth they had never expected. The leader of the group leaned in once more, his sunglasses reflecting the guard's steady face. "Look at you," he said mockingly, "all dressed up and nothing to say. What would happen if I took your hat, huh?" His words were loud, reckless, and heavy with arrogance. His friends laughed again, but their laughter no longer rang as strong. Even they could sense that the game was going too far. The rest of the crowd stood still, watching, waiting. There was no more whispering, no more nervous laughter. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind of silence that comes before thunder. Every eye was locked on the guards and the tourists. Children hid behind their parents. Elderly couples frowned deeply, hoping respect would win over foolishness. But the group pressed on, blind to the storm they were about to call upon themselves. The guards did not move. Not yet. Their training was to endure until the exact moment of danger or disrespect demanded action. The tourists, thinking themselves clever, had mistaken stillness for surrender. But the guards' silence was not surrender. It was control. And when that control broke, the foolish group would realize just how wrong they had been. The laughter of the tourists grew weaker as the crowd's disapproval grew stronger. The balance was shifting, and though the guards had not yet spoken, their presence was speaking louder than all the noise around them. The foolish group was still laughing, still mocking, still pushing. But everyone else knew that the moment of truth was only steps away. The palace stood tall behind the soldiers, timeless and dignified. The guards stood firm in front of it, symbols of honor and tradition, and in front of them stood a handful of tourists, careless and arrogant, unable to see that they were on the edge of crossing into dangerous territory. The crowd waited with bated breath, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding, as the tension reached its peak. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, sharp, and alive with expectation. And though the guards had not yet moved, the world seemed to hold its breath, knowing that the moment of stillness could not last forever. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had grown so quiet that even the sound of distant traffic seemed far away. All eyes were fixed on the group of foolish tourists who stood in front of the guards, laughing and mocking, unaware of the line they were about to cross. The guards stood like solid walls, unshaken, their eyes fixed forward, their rifles held with disciplined precision. To many in the crowd, it was a picture of strength. To the group, however, it still looked like weakness, and that belief gave them false courage. The leader of the group, with sunglasses and a mocking smile, decided to take the game one step further. He stretched his hand toward the guard's rifle, pretending to grab it. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some shouted warnings, others covered their mouths in shock, but the man's grin only widened. In that single instant, the silent stillness of the guards broke like glass. With a sharp stomp of his boot that echoed across the stone ground, the guard stepped forward. His voice, powerful and commanding, cut through the air like thunder. "Stand back!" The words rang out so loudly that even the pigeons nearby scattered into the sky. The leader of the group froze, his smile vanishing as fear rushed into his face. His friends stumbled back, their laughter gone, replaced by wide-eyed silence. The crowd gasped again, but this time in awe. The guard, who had seemed like a statue moments earlier, now radiated authority. His movements were precise, every stomp of his boot deliberate, every word sharp and heavy. Another guard joined him, stepping forward in perfect rhythm, reinforcing the warning. Their rifles glinted under the sun, their presence no longer quiet but fierce and undeniable. The foolish group stood frozen. The leader lowered his hand slowly, realizing how close he had come to making a mistake he would regret. His friends shuffled nervously, looking around as if hoping someone would laugh again to ease the tension. But no one did. The entire crowd was silent, every visitor struck by the sudden display of discipline and strength. The guards were no longer silent figures in red coats. They were soldiers, protectors, and symbols of power. Parents pulled their children closer, whispering, "Do you see? This is why we respect them." The children nodded, their eyes wide with admiration. Elderly couples straightened their posture, as though the guards' strength had spread to them too. Even the tour guides, who had been warning their groups about respect, stood proudly, relieved that the guards had reminded everyone of their true authority. The guards advanced one more step, their boots striking the ground in unison. The sound echoed like a drumbeat, and the tourists who had mocked them now trembled. The leader of the group stammered, "We were just joking," but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. His friends stepped back further, lowering their phones, their earlier boldness gone. The guards did not respond with words. Their silence returned, but this silence felt different now. It was no longer mistaken for weakness, it was power, pure and unshakable. The crowd could feel it. The foolish tourists could feel it too. What had seemed like a harmless game now felt like standing on the edge of danger. Security officers appeared quickly, their footsteps rushing across the pavement as they moved toward the scene. The guards remained firm, holding their ground, but their sudden action had made it clear that the situation was no longer just foolish behavior. It was a violation of respect. The officers moved in, surrounding the group, speaking firmly to them. The once arrogant tourists lowered their heads, mumbling excuses that no one believed. The crowd began to murmur, but the tone was different now. There was no laughter, no mocking. Instead, there was admiration. Visitors whispered to one another about how impressive the guards were, how incredible their discipline seemed. Some spoke of how they had always wondered what would happen if someone pushed too far, and now they had their answer. Others said quietly that the tourists had learned their lesson the hard way. The leader of the group tried to smile again, as if to brush off the fear, but his face was pale. His sunglasses no longer looked stylish. They looked like a mask hiding embarrassment. His friends avoided eye contact with the crowd, ashamed of how quickly their confidence had crumbled. The phones that had once been raised high to record their mocking were now lowered, screens dark. The guards returned to their posts slowly, every movement measured and precise. The stomp of their boots echoed once more, and then they stood still again, silent as stone, eyes fixed forward. But no one in the crowd would ever mistake that silence for weakness again. The guards had shown, with only a few steps and a single command, the strength that lay beneath their stillness. A hush lingered for a moment longer, and then the respectful visitors began to clap softly. It was not loud, not like applause at a performance, but a quiet sign of admiration. Parents smiled at their children, telling them to remember the moment. Some tourists wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the discipline and dignity they had just witnessed. The foolish group, meanwhile, stood trapped in humiliation, realizing that their game had turned into a lesson for everyone present. The security officers led them away, speaking in firm voices. The group did not resist, their arrogance gone. They glanced nervously at the guards one last time before disappearing into the crowd, their laughter silenced. The people who had once watched them with annoyance now looked at them with pity. They had come to mock, but they had left humbled. The guards, unchanged and calm once more, returned to their motionless stance. The palace behind them gleamed under the sunlight as if sharing in their dignity. For them, it was just another day of duty, another moment of discipline. For the crowd, however, it was unforgettable. They had seen the quiet strength of the guards transform into action, and it left a deep mark in their hearts. The children who had once been confused about the guards now looked up at them with admiration. The parents felt proud to teach their sons and daughters about respect, about patience, about strength without words. The elderly couples whispered about how rare it was to see such honor still alive in the modern world. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the memory stayed with them, carried like a story they would tell for years to come. The square outside Buckingham Palace soon returned to its usual rhythm. More tourists arrived, more photos were taken, more whispers of admiration filled the air. But those who had been present during the confrontation knew they had witnessed something rare. They had seen the boundary tested, and they had seen how swiftly and powerfully it could be defended. The foolish tourist had thought the guards were actors. They had thought the silence was weakness. They had thought their laughter was stronger than centuries of tradition. They had been wrong, and now, as the guards returned to their stillness, the world knew better. The guards stood as they always had, calm, disciplined, unshaken. But the air around them carried a new weight, a reminder that behind their silence was a storm waiting to rise if ever tested again, and everyone who saw it that day would never forget how the royal guards finally fought back. The crowd stood in stunned silence for a long moment after the guards returned to their posts. What they had just witnessed lingered in the air like an echo. The sharp command of "stand back" and the powerful stomp of boots still rang in everyone's memory. It was as if the palace grounds had been shaken, not by violence but by the sheer force of discipline and authority. Slowly the energy began to shift. Where there had been mocking laughter, there was now respect. Where there had been arrogance, there was now humility. The foolish tourists were led away by security officers, their earlier confidence drained from them. The leader, once bold and grinning behind his sunglasses, now kept his head low, his steps unsteady as if the weight of shame pressed on his shoulders. His friends followed quietly, their phones tucked away, no longer eager to record or share their actions. They had gone from performers in their own silly show to examples of how quickly arrogance can crumble. The crowd, on the other hand, felt a renewed sense of admiration for the guards. Parents crouched down to their children's level and explained softly what had happened. They spoke about respect, about how the guards were soldiers carrying the honor of a nation. Some of the children listened with wide eyes, their earlier confusion replaced with awe. Others nodded seriously, as if understanding for the first time the true weight of tradition. Tourists who had only come for photographs now realized they had witnessed something much deeper. They had seen strength in silence, and they had seen that silence break only when absolutely necessary. Many lowered their phones and put them away, choosing instead to watch the guards with their own eyes, feeling that cameras could never capture the dignity of the moment. A group of young travelers whispered among themselves, one saying, "I thought they couldn't react. I thought they were just meant to stand there." Another shook her head firmly. "No, they're soldiers. Did you see how fast and powerful that was? They're not statues. They're protectors." Their voices carried, and others around them nodded in agreement. Even the tour guides, who had often explained the rules to their groups, felt a sense of pride. For years they had told visitors that the guards were not to be mocked, that they had authority. But to see it play out in front of them gave their words new strength. Some guides began adding the fresh story into their explanations right there, telling their groups, "You see, this is why we show respect. Because these men and women are not here for us to laugh at, they are here to serve." Meanwhile, the guards themselves stood once more in silence. They did not glance at the crowd, did not allow pride or anger to show. Their discipline was complete. To them, what had just happened was not a show, nor was it personal. It was duty. They had acted when necessary, and now they returned to their stillness as if nothing had happened. But their presence carried more weight now. The crowd looked at them differently. They were no longer symbols of mystery. They were symbols of strength. As the foolish tourists were escorted farther away, the crowd began to murmur with relief. Some people even clapped softly, not like a noisy cheer but like a respectful acknowledgement. It spread gently, a ripple of admiration moving through the visitors. A few tried to take photos again, but this time the photos were filled with meaning. Instead of silly poses or mocking smiles, the images captured the guards as they truly were. Dignified, unwavering, powerful in their silence. Farther back, a young boy who had watched the entire event pulled on his father's hand. "Dad," he said, "when I grow up, I want to be strong like them." His father smiled proudly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then remember this moment," he said. "Strength is not always about shouting or fighting. Sometimes it is about standing tall and doing your duty, even when people don't understand." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with new admiration. The story began spreading almost instantly. Many tourists had recorded parts of the incident on their phones. Within hours, videos appeared online, shared across social platforms. The clips showed the mocking tourists, the sudden stomp of the guard's boot, and the thunderous command that silenced everyone. Comments poured in from around the world. Some people were shocked, others impressed, but most supported the guards. They praised their discipline, their patience, and their powerful response. News outlets picked up the story, writing about how the guards had finally shown their strength to a group of disrespectful tourists. Headlines described the dramatic moment, and photos of the guards went viral. For many, it was a reminder that the royal guards were not entertainers but soldiers. People who had once thought of them as only ceremonial figures now understood that their role carried real authority. Back at the palace, the atmosphere shifted even as new waves of tourists arrived. Word of what had happened spread quickly among visitors. Many who approached the gates now did so with greater care, speaking in lower voices, moving respectfully, and keeping their distance from the guards. It was as if the event had cast an invisible line of respect around the soldiers. No one dared to test it again, at least not that day. The guards continued their duties without a word, their posture unchanged, their silence unbroken. But for the crowd, the silence now felt louder than any voice. It carried with it the memory of the stomp, the command, and the power of centuries-old discipline. The tourists who stood nearby could feel it too. Some even placed their hands over their hearts, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect for what they had just seen. The foolish group, meanwhile, disappeared from the palace grounds, their adventure ruined. They had come for laughs and attention, but what they left with was humiliation. For them, it was a memory they would not forget, a reminder that some traditions should never be mocked. Their arrogance had been replaced with silence, their laughter with regret. For everyone else, the lesson was clear. Respect was not optional in front of the guards. These men and women were not decorations for photographs nor actors in costumes. They were protectors of history, defenders of dignity, and symbols of honor. And in that moment, their strength had spoken louder than any insult ever could. As the day went on, the palace grounds returned to normal. Tourists posed for respectful pictures, children pointed at the guards with admiration, and the changing of the guard ceremony drew gasps of wonder from those seeing it for the first time. But underneath it all, the air felt different. It carried the weight of the story, a story that would spread from one person to another, from one country to another, reminding the world of what respect truly meant. Even long after the crowd had thinned and the sun began to set, those who had been present carried the memory with them. They would tell their friends, their families, their co-workers. They would say, "I saw the royal guards react. I saw their strength." And each retelling would add to the growing respect for the soldiers who stood in silence at the gates of history. For the guards, it was only one more day in their long service. For the foolish tourists, it was a lesson they would not forget. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that silence is not weakness, that patience is not surrender, and that when tested, true strength always reveals itself. The palace grounds slowly returned to their usual rhythm, but the memory of what had happened earlier in the day lingered in the minds of everyone who had been there. The guards stood as still as ever, their faces calm, their posture sharp, and their silence heavy with meaning. To them, it was just another moment of duty, something they had been trained for and prepared to handle. But for the crowd and for the world beyond, it was more than that. It was a story waiting to be told, a lesson waiting to spread. Tourists who had witnessed the event began to share their experiences as soon as they left the palace gates. Some sat at nearby cafes, replaying the videos on their phones and showing them to others. Their voices carried excitement, disbelief, and deep respect. "I couldn't believe how fast he moved," one visitor said to her family. her eyes still wide. He didn't even hesitate. One stomp and one command, and the whole place went silent. Her children leaned in closer, absorbing every word, as though it were a tale from history. Another group of travelers discussed the moment with admiration. One man shook his head and said, "I always thought they were just for ceremony. I thought they were there to look impressive. But now I know they're real soldiers. They're guardians," his friend agreed. "It makes me proud to see traditions like this still alive. They're not just guarding a palace, they're guarding respect itself." Meanwhile, families who had been present took the lesson home to their children. At dinner tables across the city, children repeated the story, telling their grandparents or cousins about the foolish tourists and how the guards had responded. Parents used the moment as an example, teaching them that discipline and silence can sometimes be stronger than shouting or laughing. For the children, the story grew into a memory that would last, shaping how they viewed respect and authority. Within hours, the videos of the event began spreading online. Social media lit up with clips showing the moment the guard stepped forward, his boot striking the ground and his voice booming with command. Millions of viewers watched from around the world. Some clicked out of curiosity, but many stayed for the powerful message the video carried. Comments flooded in, praising the guards for their patience and their discipline. Others admitted they had never truly understood the role of the guards until now. News channels soon picked up the story. Anchors described the dramatic confrontation, showing footage of the foolish tourists mocking the guards, and then the sudden, powerful reaction that silenced them. Reporters interviewed bystanders who spoke of the respect they felt in that moment. Headlines appeared across newspapers and online articles, each one highlighting the lesson that had unfolded in front of Buckingham Palace. The foolish tourists who had been at the center of it all were not named, but their faces in the videos were recognized by many. Instead of receiving the attention they had craved, they became symbols of arrogance and disrespect. Strangers online criticized their actions, calling them careless and embarrassing. Some even suggested that the group had been lucky the guards had shown restraint, because their actions could have caused far more serious consequences. But the story was not just about their humiliation. It was about the strength of the guards, the weight of tradition, and the reminder that respect should never be forgotten. Across the world, viewers watched the videos and spoke about the lesson. Teachers showed the clips in classrooms, using them as examples to explain discipline and history. Parents used the story at home to remind their children about respect for authority. Even military veterans in other countries praised the guards, writing that they understood the patience it took to endure mockery until the right moment to act arrived. Back in London, the story continued to spread. Tour guides added the incident into their talks, saying, "Just recently a group tested the guards, and they were reminded why these men and women are not to be mocked." Visitors listened more closely, their faces filled with awe. The atmosphere around the palace seemed to change. Where once tourists might have stepped too close for a funny picture, now they stood a little farther back, speaking in quieter voices. The memory of the stomp and the command still hung in the air, invisible but powerful. For the guards, nothing changed outwardly. They still stood tall, their uniforms perfect, their silence unbroken. But they had reminded everyone of who they were and what they stood for. Their duty was not just to guard the palace, but to guard the respect tied to centuries of tradition. They did not need to move often. They did not need to shout frequently. Their stillness itself was enough most of the time. But when they did act, the world paid attention. As days passed, the incident continued to live on in conversations, in news articles, in videos shared again and again. People from countries far away, who had never visited London, now felt they understood something about the royal guards. They admired their strength, their patience, and their dignity. Many expressed a new desire to see them in person, not to mock them, but to admire them. The story became not just a warning, but an inspiration. The foolish tourists themselves remained silent after the event. Perhaps they regretted their actions. Perhaps they wished to forget. But their silence was overshadowed by the louder voices of those who had learned something valuable. In a way, their arrogance had served a purpose. It had given the world a reminder it needed. Even weeks later, when new crowds gathered outside the palace, people whispered about the day the guards had fought back. Parents told the story again to their children. Couples recalled it to each other, and strangers exchanged knowing glances when someone stepped too close to the barriers. The invisible line of respect was clearer than ever. The lesson reached beyond the palace gates. It reminded people everywhere that respect is not something old-fashioned or outdated. It is timeless. It is the thread that connects history to the present, and it is what gives traditions their true power. The guards were living proof of that truth. They showed that silence is not weakness, that patience is not surrender, and that true strength lies in knowing when to act and when to remain still. As the sun set over London one evening, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, the guards stood firm in their places. Tourists gathered again, their voices soft, their steps careful. Children pointed with wide eyes. Adults snapped respectful photos, and everyone felt the weight of history pressing gently around them. No one dared to mock. No one dared to laugh. The memory of the stomp and the command was still alive, echoing in the silence. For the guards, it was another day, another duty completed with discipline. For the visitors, it was an experience they would carry home and tell again and again. For the world, it was a story that reminded everyone of the power of respect. And in the end, that was the true victory. Not the silencing of foolish tourists, but the awakening of respect in the hearts of those who watched and those who listened. The royal guards returned to their stillness, their silence once again unbroken. But to those who had seen and to those who had heard, the silence no longer seemed empty. It was filled with meaning. It was filled with strength, and it carried a message that would echo far beyond the palace gates. Respect is timeless and discipline never fades.